On April 17, 1955, Albert Einstein was rushed to the hospital due to chest pain. At that moment, he had no idea, but the abdominal section of his aorta, the largest artery in the body, had ballooned and ruptured. He was suffering from internal bleeding, a condition known as an abdominal aortic aneurysm. At the time, he was busy preparing a speech he was to read on television to celebrate the 7th anniversary of the founding of Israel. His doctors insisted on immediate surgery. But Einstein, who had undergone a similar operation 8 years earlier, seemed to understand that the end was near. He refused with words that would become immortal. "I want to go when I want. It is tasteless to prolong life artificially. I have done my share, it is time to go. I will do it elegantly." And so he did. In the early hours of the following day at Princeton Hospital, Einstein passed away. If you've ever watched the series House MD, the name of that hospital might sound familiar. But contrary to what the series might imply, the hospital shown on the show has nothing to do with the real Princeton Hospital. The show's writers probably chose the name deliberately, but what happened next is even more intriguing. Only 7 hours after Einstein's death, during his autopsy, pathologist Thomas Harvey did something unthinkable. Without the permission of Einstein's family, he removed Einstein's brain, cut it into sections, and preserved it in formalin. His goal? To study what he believed to be a uniquely gifted brain and perhaps discover the biological roots of Einstein's brilliance. But Einstein had explicitly expressed that he didn't want to be idolized. In fact, he wished for his body to be cremated and his ashes scattered secretly, a wish Harvey blatantly ignored. And it wasn't just the brain. Harvey also removed Einstein's eyes and gifted them to the scientist's ophthalmologist, Henry Abrams. Realizing the trouble he was in, Harvey contacted Einstein's son, Hans Albert, and somehow convinced him of the scientific value of what he had done. Hans reluctantly granted him retroactive permission, sparing Harvey from legal consequences. But Hans set a strict condition. Einstein's brain could only be studied for scientific purposes, and the findings had to be published in reputable academic journals. Harvey agreed, promising to publish his research within a year. From that day on, Einstein's brain became the subject of numerous studies. So what did scientists actually find? Could the extraordinary genius of Einstein truly be seen in the physical structure of his brain? Let's take a closer look. Let's now dive into what was discovered about Einstein's brain. One of the most widespread myths about him is that despite his genius, he got poor grades in school. It's easy to see why people like this idea. If Einstein was treated like a failure in school, then maybe there's hope for the rest of us too. That's partly why I'm making this video, to set the record straight. If we can truly understand what made Einstein Einstein, then perhaps we can be like him, or even surpass him. But to succeed, the first thing you have to do is stop lying to yourself. Sure, grades aren't the ultimate predictor of success, but the idea that Einstein did poorly in school is simply false. And we know this thanks to records like his high school report card dated September 30th, 1890. Back then, in Switzerland, the grading system ranged from 1 lowest to 6 highest. Looking closely at his grades, Einstein scored 6 in algebra, geometry, physics, and history, 5 in chemistry, natural history, and German literature, and 4 in drawing and geography. His lowest grade? A 3 in French. Not bad at all. And Einstein wasn't just successful in high school. In a letter his mother Pauline once wrote to his sister, Albert received his report card yesterday. Once again, he's top of his class and his grades are excellent. Sure, like any student, Einstein had his moments of tension with teachers. One teacher at the Luitpold Gymnasium even said, "I wish Einstein were not my student." But not because he was lazy. It was because he sat at the back of the class, smiling at the lectures. The teacher took it as a sign of disrespect and once angrily told him, "You will never amount to anything." But isolated anecdotes like these cannot define a person's entire academic life. When we look at the full picture, it's clear that Einstein was far from a failure. So why does this myth persist? Because it's comforting. It makes people feel better about their own shortcomings. Yes, Einstein disliked the rigid, militaristic tone of traditional education. He wrote about it in many of his letters. But that doesn't mean he was ever a bad student. Another possible source of the myth that Einstein had poor grades lies in a misunderstanding of the grading systems used in different countries. Einstein was born on March 14, 1879, in the German Empire and attended school there until high school. In Germany, the grading system was the opposite of Switzerland's. A grade of 1 was the best, and 6 was the worst. So, before he moved to Switzerland, all his report cards were filled with 1s, which meant top marks. But many people unfamiliar with the German system assumed he was getting the lowest possible grades. Things got even more confusing when he started high school in Switzerland. Until 1896, Einstein's final year at that school, they were still using the German grading system. But in that very year, the system was reversed, adopting the Swiss model, where 6 was now the highest grade and 1 the lowest. This inconsistency added to the confusion. But from family letters and other surviving records, we know that Einstein's grades were consistently good, often excellent. So then what fueled his outstanding academic performance? And later, his extraordinary genius? Could the answer lie within his brain? That's the question that has fascinated scientists for decades. Not just in Einstein's case, but when it comes to geniuses in general. Can we physically identify what makes a mind extraordinary? Are these individuals born gifted? Or does their obsession with a subject literally shape their brain's structure? That's exactly what pathologist Thomas Harvey hoped to understand when he, perhaps without any real authority, made a bold and hasty decision to preserve Einstein's brain and study it for clues. After removing Einstein's brain, Harvey took dozens of photographs and, along with his mentor Harry Zimmerman, sectioned it into 240 blocks, each about 10 cubic centimeters in size. From these, he prepared microscopic slides for analysis. The sections were carefully mapped according to the Cerebral Cortex Atlas published by Economo and Koskinas in 1925, and largely followed the brain region definitions established by Brodmann in the 19th century. In other words, the sections weren't random. They targeted known functional areas of the brain. But here's the problem. Neither Harvey nor Zimmerman were experts in neuroscience or brain anatomy. They were pathologists, skilled in identifying traumatic injuries or hemorrhages, but not trained to decipher the secrets of one of the most exceptional brains in history. So, despite promising Hans Einstein, Albert's son, that he'd publish his findings within a year, Harvey never did. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know what to look for. And soon things spiraled out of control. Although Hans had given him permission, the head of the hospital didn't think that excused Harvey's actions. Just days later, citing ethical violations, Harvey was forced to resign from Princeton Hospital. Unable to stay in New Jersey, he packed up and moved west, carrying with him 2 large jars containing Einstein's brain. There, he worked as a general practitioner in the American Midwest. Harvey was eccentric, even dreamlike in his thinking. And because of this, the academic world dismissed him. For 30 years, he tried to convince someone, anyone, to study Einstein's brain. No one took him seriously. Eventually, he traveled across the country to give the brain to Einstein's granddaughter, who lived in California. She refused to take it. Einstein's brain, it seemed, had become a burden, a curse. After decades of carting the jars from place to place, Harvey eventually returned to where it all began. He handed the brain samples to the pathologist who had replaced him at Princeton. A 40-year odyssey had come to an end. Only then did the scientific community begin to show real interest. The first serious study on Einstein's brain was published in 1999, 44 years after his death. Since then, various parts of the brain and Harvey's original photographs have been examined. And the findings? Surprising, to say the least. First, Einstein's brain wasn't unusually large. In fact, it was smaller than average. For a man of his age and weight, a typical brain weighs around 1,400 grams. Einstein's weighed just 1,230 grams. When it comes to brains, bigger doesn't always mean better. A smaller brain packed with denser neural connections can actually process information more efficiently. Still, Einstein's brain showed even more unusual features. Let me show you some of them directly. This is an average human brain viewed from the top. Here's the frontal cortex, the area associated with reasoning and abstract thought. On a typical brain, you'll see 3 major ridges, or gyri, in this region. 1, 2, 3. Now look at a photograph of Einstein's brain, taken by Harvey from the same angle. Notice the space between the hemispheres, but the longitudinal fissure, it's here too. But count the gyri right now. 1, 2, 3, 4. An extra ridge. This 4th gyrus appears in the right frontal lobe, a region linked to nonverbal skills like visual spatial reasoning and mathematical intuition. No surprise there, but there's more. Take a look at this enormous ridge near the motor cortex. Now compare it to a standard human brain. The same ridge isn't present. This area is called the hand knob, often shaped like a hook or the Greek letter omega. It controls fine motor skills in the hands and fingers. Studies have shown that people who start playing violin between the ages of 6 and 14 tend to have this omega-shaped ridge. Just by looking at this feature, one could guess that Einstein played violin and that he started before age 14. And they'd be right. Einstein's mother was a pianist, and he began playing violin at the age of 6. He continued playing for the rest of his life. Let's look at another photo, this time from the front left view of Einstein's brain. Here's the longitudinal fissure again, dividing the brain in half. Even without expert knowledge, something stands out. That unusual bulge, right where the motor cortex is located. It's this region that governs voluntary muscle movements, like those in our hands. One of the most unexpected discoveries came not from photographs, but from what researchers saw under the microscope. By slicing Einstein's brain into sections and counting individual neurons, scientists noticed something strange. In Brodmann Area 39, located in the left hemisphere, Einstein had fewer neurons than average. This area is responsible for language comprehension, for understanding words. And in Einstein's case, this makes perfect sense. He didn't speak fluently until the age of 6. Throughout childhood, he struggled with issues similar to dyslexia. He couldn't easily put thoughts into writing, he often forgot words, he had trouble reading out loud. So, no, Einstein wasn't reading by the age of 2 or doing abstract mathematics at 4. He developed slowly and differently. We'll come back to this point in a moment. But now let's highlight another fascinating pattern in Einstein's brain. Many of the most distinct differences weren't in his thinking regions. They were in the areas linked to motor control and sensory perception. This too fits with what we know about him. Einstein didn't think in words. In fact, when told that most people have an inner voice narrating their thoughts, he laughed. He found the idea completely foreign. Einstein thought in colors, in sounds, in movements. He was what we call a synesthete, someone whose senses are deeply interconnected. When Einstein got stuck on a problem, he didn't always sit down with pen and paper. Sometimes he would play the violin for hours. Then suddenly he'd stop, shout, "I've got it!" and begin turning those mental shapes into equations. His relationship with the universe wasn't based on data. It was based on aesthetic intuition. While most physicists built theories from observations in mathematics, Einstein began with beauty. As one famous physicist put it, Einstein didn't ask, "Does this theory fit the data?" He asked, If I were God, is this how I would have created the universe? This approach, driven by elegance and symmetry, worked wonders in his early career. In fact, his theory of special relativity, where space and time became two sides of the same coin, was born from this sense of beauty. But this very mindset would later hold him back. While developing general relativity, Einstein spent 2 years chasing more aesthetically pleasing equations. He kept rejecting the correct solution because it wasn't beautiful enough. Only when he finally surrendered to the raw flow of mathematics did he unlock the theory that explained how mass bends space-time. This shift from beauty to math brought him great success. But it also marked the beginning of a decline. In the second half of his life, Einstein became more rigid. He stopped trusting intuition and began focusing only on formal equations. The result? His productivity declined, and his loyalty to classical physics blinded him to the promise of quantum mechanics, a field that overturned many of his core beliefs. He resisted it, dismissed it, and made mistake after mistake. But these are stories for another time. If you're enjoying this kind of content, don't forget to turn on the notifications so you won't miss our upcoming videos. Now, of course, not everything in Einstein's brain was unusual in a way that explained his language delays. Some features did seem to reflect his genius in mathematics and physics. For instance, the left inferior parietal lobe, responsible for mathematical reasoning, symbolic thinking, and reading complex texts, was found to be 15% larger than average. Studies also suggest that Einstein's hippocampus, related to memory, and parts of his neocortex linked to higher-order thinking, were relatively well developed. And then there's the corpus callosum, the bundle of nerve fibers connecting the two hemispheres. In Einstein's brain, it was denser than normal. This may have allowed his brain to function more like a supercomputer, with faster and more coordinated communication between hemispheres. So let's ask the big question. Was Einstein born with this extraordinary brain, or did it develop because he spent a lifetime immersed in abstract thought? Let's be clear, the brain is not a static organ. It's more like warm plastic, malleable, adaptable. We call this neuroplasticity. When you first encountered math or physics as a child, some of your brain's 100 billion neurons began forming new connections to process these ideas. The more you pushed yourself to understand the hard stuff, the stronger and more numerous those connections became. In other words, learning physically reshapes your brain. That said, these changes mostly occur at the microscopic level. They rarely affect the brain's gross anatomy, things like folds and grooves, because by the age of 6, the human brain has already reached 90% of its adult size. If something does alter those structures, it usually happens before that age. And we know Einstein didn't start thinking deeply about physics as a toddler. His interest began at 5, when his father gave him a simple compass, but his serious thinking didn't start until much later. So while we can't say for sure, current evidence suggests that at least some of the unusual features in his brain were likely innate. Still, many historians agree. What made Einstein Einstein wasn't just his biology, but also his life circumstances. We focused on his brain in this video, but we didn't touch on the experiences, the struggles, or the moments that shaped his personality and thinking. But let's make this one thing clear. Einstein didn't become a genius by simply sitting around and relying on raw talent. In fact, the learning difficulties he faced in childhood may have forced him to think and learn in unconventional ways. And even while working at a patent office to make ends meet, he never stopped thinking about physics, never stopped studying the work of the most respected minds in his field. His determination, discipline, and grit transformed his raw ability into real-world breakthroughs. Because genius doesn't emerge from thin air. Research after research shows that genius isn't about genes alone. It's not just brain anatomy, or just hard work, or just luck, or just socioeconomic status. It's about all of these things, in different amounts for different people. Yes, maybe Einstein had a head start. Maybe you weren't born with a brain like his. Maybe your school grades don't match his. That's fine, you can't change those things. But here's what you can change. You can harness neuroplasticity. You can learn how to put yourself in situations that lead to growth. You can cultivate the mindset that turns effort into excellence. And let's be honest, most people don't do that. They give up and say, well, I'm just not Einstein. That excuse doesn't hold up. In future videos, we'll show how pure curiosity and the right guidance can completely transform a person. But for now, just remember this. Next time you're learning something new or diving deep into a topic that fascinates you, don't just imagine yourself gaining knowledge. Picture your brain physically transforming. New connections forming. Old ones strengthening. That mental image alone can make the experience more powerful and more enjoyable. Try it, you'll see. Until next time, take care and keep thinking deeply.